Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, today we're unraveling a pretty massive mystery. We're going to look at how a totally forgotten book completely defied the laws of traditional retail and, in the process, revealed a hidden truth about the future of business. We're talking about a massive shift in how we discover, consume, and actually value products. Let's just jump right in.
Picture this. It's 1998 and a blockbuster climbing book called Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer hits the shelves. It becomes an absolute publishing sensation, right? It was everywhere. But then something really weird happened. A decade-old, mostly forgotten book about a similar topic called Touching the Void suddenly started outselling it 2-to-1. No way, right? This wasn't a sequel. There was no massive marketing campaign behind it. So how in the world does a book that's practically out of print just suddenly defeat a massive new hit?
Well, the answer lies in what we're going to call the Amazon effect. See, online booksellers combined infinite shelf space with real-time buying trends and recommendation algorithms. When customers bought the massive hit, the system automatically recommended that forgotten book. The algorithm essentially picked up on a pattern. Hey, people who like harrowing climbing stories like Krakauer's also really enjoyed Joe Simpson's older book. And that created this incredibly powerful positive feedback loop. It literally resurrected a dead title and, frankly, highlighted a massive cultural shift.
To understand exactly how this niche product defeated a mega hit, we're going to explore this shift through 5 distinct stages: the era beyond hits, the tyranny of locality, the 98% rule, mapping the long tail, and finally the economics of abundance.
So, starting with part 1, the era beyond hits and the shattering of the mainstream. We're entering a time where those massive blockbusters that used to completely define our common experience are just losing their grip on the culture. Audiences today are shifting into this confusing, sprawling mosaic of a million mini-markets and micro-stars. Just think about kids today growing up with infinite digital choices. They honestly don't distinguish between mainstream hits and underground niches. They just pick what they like from a limitless menu where massive Hollywood blockbusters and indie garage bands are literally listed right side by side. Gone are the days when we all watched the exact same sitcom on Thursday night, We're moving from one massive single mass market to a mass of hyper-specific niches.
Which brings us to Section 2, the tyranny of locality and the constraints of the physical world.
We really have to ask, why were we so obsessed with hits for the last century anyway? It all comes down to the physical limitations of traditional retail. Historically, our culture was hit-driven simply because shelf space is incredibly expensive. An average physical record store needs a CD to sell at least 4 copies a year just to pay the rent for that half-inch of plastic sitting on the shelf. Compare a typical Blockbuster video store, which carried maybe 3,000 DVDs, to a digital platform like Netflix offering tens of thousands. When you run a physical store, you suffer from the tyranny of locality. You have to stock what appeals to the lowest common denominator in your specific geographic radius. You literally cannot afford to carry something that only one single person in your town might want.
Let's move on to Section 3, the 98% rule and the digital revelation.
Okay, get this. A digital jukebox company called eCast discovered a data point that completely turned the traditional retail model upside down. They discovered a fascinating metric known as the 98% rule. They found that when shelf space is infinite, like, say, in a digital jukebox, 98% of all available albums will sell at least one track every single quarter. Think about that for a second. Almost everything sells. In the physical world, a huge percentage of inventory just sits there gathering dust, which is obviously a retail nightmare. But in the digital world, almost nothing collects digital dust. There is always someone, somewhere, who wants that obscure track.
And it turns out, this is no fluke. The 98% rule is remarkably universal across all sorts of digital platforms. Whether it's Apple seeing every single one of its millions of tracks sell, Netflix seeing 95% of its massive DVD catalog rented out, or Amazon selling almost every single book in its top 100,000. When scarcity is completely removed from the equation, almost every single niche product finds an audience. Demand beyond the top hits isn't just a trickle, it is effectively limitless. All right, Section 4, mapping the long tail and visualizing infinite choice.
Let's actually map out what this infinite demand looks like on a graph, because it's completely different from what economists are used to. Looking at a traditional demand curve based on data from the digital music service Rhapsody, you've got this massive spike on the left side for the top hits, and then it just falls off steeply. Those top 4,500 albums account for most of the sales, and that is exactly where a physical store like Walmart cuts off its inventory. They literally do not have the physical shelf space to carry anything to the right of that line. For a century, this is all we looked at. We just assumed that past this cutoff, demand simply didn't exist.
But if we turn our heads to the right and zoom in past those top sellers, a completely different picture emerges. You'll see these obscure non-hits are still getting hundreds of downloads a month. Because there are so many of these non-hits, all those small individual sales add up incredibly fast. In just this section of the curve alone, it adds up to an astounding 22 million downloads a month. That completely defies the logic of the traditional hit-driven market. And panning even further down the curve, way out to the 800,000th track, the tail just keeps going. Here, a track might only get downloaded maybe 4 or 5 times a month. Individually, absolutely none of these are popular in any traditional sense. But collectively, they represent a massive 15% of Rhapsody's total business. This right here, this is the long tail. When you multiply a very big number of unique products by a relatively small number of sales for each, you still get a massive, highly lucrative market.
Which brings us to our final section, number 5, the economics of abundance, and our new economic reality.
Everything we've seen so far culminates in a total rethinking of how modern businesses thrive. Check out this incredible realization. For massive digital retailers like Amazon, Netflix, and Rhapsody, 25 to 45% of their total sales come from products you literally cannot find in a physical store. Really think about the magnitude of that for a second. Their biggest growth market isn't the blockbuster hit, it's the stuff that traditional retail just cast aside because it simply wasn't popular enough to justify physical shelf space.
I absolutely love this analogy from the source material. Think of these falling distribution costs as a dropping waterline, revealing a new land that has been there all along, just underwater. It's so perfect. If traditional hits are these visible islands jutting out of the ocean of culture, the internet is basically dropping the waterline and revealing this massive, highly profitable underwater mountain of niches. All those previously hidden products, indie films, obscure academic texts, niche hobbyist music, they're finally accessible to anyone who wants them.
Because there are no manufacturing costs, no packaging, no shelf space fees for digital goods, a million individual fringe sales become just as profitable as a single massive hit. This fundamentally changes the game. Suddenly, popularity no longer has a monopoly on profitability. Both massive hits and totally obscure niches are just entries in a digital database. Both are equally worthy of being carried, and both are perfectly capable of finding their ideal audience.
So that brings us to a rather fascinating conclusion. With the long tail completely rewriting the economics of abundance, we're no longer forced to just consume whatever the lowest common denominator hit happens to be. We actually have the freedom to dive as deep as we want into our own hyper-specific interests. So my question for you to ponder today is this. Since popularity no longer dictates what we can consume, what niche do you belong to now that the mainstream isn't your only choice? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this changes how you look at the media you consume.